9 languages, Your Highness. He spoke 9 languages. The advisor's voice echoed in the hall like a cracked bell, carrying news no one wanted to hear. Lady Emily Carter felt the blood chill in her veins, her fingers tightening on the blue fabric of her gown. Beside her, Prince Andrew Collins remained still on the elevated dais, but she could sense the tension coiling beneath his mask of indifference. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of melting candle wax and the nervous sweat of dozens of nobles clustered on the oak benches. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting shadows that seemed to shift as heads turned, whispering, calculating the weight of those words. In the center of the hall, alone like an island surrounded by sharks, Daniel Morgan awaited the verdict. His simple clothes contrasted sharply with the surrounding opulence, but there was something in the way he stood, erect, without arrogance or submission, that made Emily's heart beat erratically. She could still hear every word he had spoken, first in the common tongue of the realm, then in the northern dialect in Latin to answer the bishop, and then in languages she never imagined a man like him would know. The last one especially had made her tremble. It was the language her mother had whispered in her ear as a child, sweet ancient words that had died with her. How is it possible that a mere knight— The Duke of Westmarch began to mutter, but Andrew raised a hand, silencing him. Emily felt the prince's gaze on her, studying her reaction, measuring her breath. She tried to keep her face serene, but her hands trembled slightly. It was impossible to feign indifference when every fiber of her being screamed that something fundamental had shifted in that moment. The silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Daniel did not lower his eyes. He did not beg for clemency. He simply waited. And in that waiting was a dignity that cut Emily like a sharp blade. "Escort him out," Andrew said finally, his voice controlled but with a note of coldness she knew well. "We have much to discuss regarding exceptions to the natural order of things." When Daniel was led away, Emily felt as if a part of herself left with him, her nails dug into her palms, seeking a physical pain to distract her from the emotional storm brewing in her chest. Prince Andrew turned to her then, a polite smile on his lips, but his eyes cold as stone. "My dear Emily," he said softly, for her ears alone, "I hope you found the demonstration instructive." The hall began to empty, but Emily remained, feeling the world rearrange itself around her. 9 languages, a landless knight who spoke 9 languages, and she, a promised bride, whose destiny had just become infinitely more complicated. 3 days had passed since the hearing, and Emily could still feel the echo of those languages reverberating in her mind. She moved through the castle corridors like a shadow of herself, performing her duties with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to exist without questioning. The green silk gown whispered against the cold stone floor as she made her way to Andrew's chambers. The morning meeting had become routine since the engagement announcement, an hour dedicated to discussing wedding preparations, guests, and the political alliances that would be sealed with their vows. Emily played her part perfectly, nodding at the right moments, offering suggestions when prompted, always maintaining the appropriate smile. But this time was different. Ever since Daniel Morgan spoke in that hall, something within her had awakened, a restlessness that grew with every passing hour. "Emily," Andrew greeted her as she entered his quarters. He stood by the window, observing the gardens where servants trimmed the rose bushes. The morning light illuminated his fair hair and highlighted the firm line of his jaw. He was a handsome man, Emily knew that, powerful, intelligent, destined to rule. Any woman in the realm should consider herself fortunate to have his attention. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? "Your Highness," she replied, offering a graceful curtsy. "How was your night?" "Well," he said, turning to face her. His blue eyes studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Though I had much to consider. About loyalty, about exceptions." Emily kept her expression neutral, but her heart quickened. "Exceptions, Your Highness?" Andrew approached, his steps echoing on the polished marble. "Our knight of many tongues caused quite an impression at court. Some have begun to question why a man of such humble origins possesses knowledge that rivals that of our finest diplomats. Perhaps because knowledge recognizes no lineage." The words escaped before Emily could stop them. The silence that followed was so dense she could hear her own breathing. Andrew stopped a few feet from her, his head tilted slightly. "That is an interesting comment. Should I interpret that as a defense of Daniel Morgan?" "Interpret it as you wish, Your Highness." Emily raised her chin, a desperate courage taking hold of her. "I merely observe that wisdom can flourish in any soil, provided it finds the right conditions." "Wisdom," Andrew repeated the word as if testing its flavor. Or is it arrogance disguised? A man who forgets his place can be dangerous, Emily, to himself and to those around him. The implicit threat made Emily shiver, but she did not back down. And a man who knows exactly his place, Your Highness, does he never pose a danger? Andrew's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Emily saw beyond the princely mask, glimpsing something darker, more possessive. Be careful, my dear. Your tongue is becoming as sharp as our multilingual knights. He then moved away, walking back to the window. Daniel Morgan will leave tomorrow for a mission on the northern border. Delicate diplomatic matters that require his special skills. He will be absent indefinitely. Emily felt as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. A dangerous mission? All missions have their risks, Andrew said without turning, especially for those who do not know how to stay in their proper place. The air in the chambers seemed thin. Emily understood the message in its entirety. Daniel was being sent away, possibly never to return, and she was being warned about the consequences of identifying with exceptions. The wedding, Andrew said, finally turning around. It will be moved up. 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks? Emily couldn't hide her surprise. But the preparation? They will be adequate for the occasion. My mother is already organizing the details. He approached again, this time stopping very close. Emily could feel the heat of his body, the expensive cologne he wore. I believe a swift marriage will be beneficial for all involved. Emily lowered her eyes, fighting against a sensation that the walls were closing in around her. As you wish, Your Highness. Very well. Andrew lightly touched her chin, forcing her to look at him. Remember, Emily, you were chosen to be a princess, a future queen. It is an honor few women receive. It would be a shame to waste such an opportunity on unnecessary sentimentality. When he released her, Emily offered another curtsy and withdrew. In the corridor, she leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to catch her breath. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from a dull fury rising in her chest. Daniel would leave the next day. In 2 weeks she would be married, and between those two events her life would be sealed forever. But as she walked back to her chambers, Emily made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. If only 2 weeks of freedom remained, she would not waste them pretending to be the perfect, submissive bride. There had to be a way to speak with Daniel before his departure. There had to be. And she would find it, if it was the last thing she did as a single woman. The chapel attached to the castle remained empty during the afternoon hours, save for the golden rays of sun filtering through the stained glass windows. Emily had chosen the location not out of devotion but strategy. It was one of the few places a noblewoman could remain alone without raising suspicion, and the stone pillars offered enough shadows for discreet conversations. Margaret, her most trusted lady-in-waiting, had secured the information Emily needed. Daniel Morgan would come to the chapel at twilight for a final prayer before his departure. It was customary for knights on mission to seek divine blessing, especially when they knew they might not return. Emily arrived first, kneeling before the altar as if in deep prayer. Her fingers squeezed the pearl rosary, but her mind was far from any sacred contemplation. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she had to take several deep breaths to control the tremor in her hands. When she heard footsteps echoing on the marble, she knew immediately it was him. There was a particular cadence to the way Daniel walked, a rhythm that spoke of purpose without haste, of contained strength. Emily did not turn, keeping her eyes fixed on the golden crucifix before her. Lady Emily. His voice was lower than she remembered, carrying a gravity that made her shiver. Sir Daniel. She rose slowly, turning to face him. The colored light from the stained glass painted blue and red shadows on his face, making him appear almost ethereal. I came to pray for the safety of all who depart on mission for the realm. How generous of you. There was something in his eyes, a mutual understanding that both knew exactly why they were there, and it had nothing to do with conventional prayers. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them like a tangible presence. Emily observed his hands, strong and calloused from using a sword, but also stained with ink, a sign of someone who spent as much time writing as fighting. Is it true what they say? She asked finally. That the mission is dangerous? Daniel tilted his head slightly. All missions have their challenges, but I trust in my preparation and divine protection. And if divine protection is not enough? The words came out more urgently than Emily intended. If you do not return, he took a step forward, and for the first time she saw something beyond controlled composure in his eyes. Why would that matter to the future princess? Emily felt the blood rush to her face. Because, She struggled to find words that wouldn't irrevocably compromise her, because I believe the realm loses something valuable when men of true merit vanish without a trace. True merit. Daniel repeated her words, and there was a note of bitterness in his voice, a dangerous quality for someone without the proper lineage to sustain it. Lineage does not make the man, Sir Daniel. Your actions at the hearing proved that. My actions at the hearing sealed my fate. He moved closer, and Emily could see the lines of tension around his eyes, just as they may have sealed the fate of others. The meaning of his words struck Emily like a physical blow. He knew. He knew that his display of knowledge had created ripples that extended beyond himself. Prince Andrew, she began, he is a man who understands power. Daniel interrupted her softly, and I made the mistake of demonstrating that there are forms of power that do not depend on a crown or title. Emily took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Then why did you do it? Why did you risk it? Because an injustice was being committed, and because— he hesitated, her gaze fixed on his eyes. Because there was someone watching whom I could not disappoint. The air between them felt electrified. Emily could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way his breathing had become slightly irregular. She knew she should retreat, that every second in that proximity was a calculated risk that grew exponentially. Instead, she raised her hand and lightly touched his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart through the tunic fabric. The language you used last, she whispered, at the hearing. It was the language of my childhood. My mother used to tell me stories in those words. Daniel covered her hand with his, and the touch was so warm, Emily felt as if she were burning. I learned it from a traveling monk when I was young. He said it was the language of poets and dreamers. And are you a dreamer, Sir Daniel? I was, he said, his thumb tracing a smooth line over her fingers. Until I understood that some dreams are too dangerous to be dreamed aloud. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. What if I said some dreams are worth the risk? I would say, you are braver than you are sensible. He brought her hand to his lips, placing a soft kiss on her palm. The gesture was both reverent and desperate. And I would say that courage might cost you more than you are prepared to pay. The wedding has been moved up, she said abruptly. 2 weeks. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if he had received a physical blow. When he opened them again, there was a fierce resolve in his gaze. Then it is better that I do not return, he said simply. No, the word came out as a whispered cry. Don't say that. Don't think that. Emily. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a farewell at the same time. Do you understand what is happening here? What this means? I understand that for the first time in my life I feel truly alive. The words came out in a rush, charged with all the emotion she had been suppressing. I understand that there is a difference between existing to fulfill expectations and living to choose your own destiny. Daniel released her then, stepping back. And do you also understand that choosing can have terrible consequences for both of us? I understand. Emily raised her chin, a new determination shining in her eyes. But I also understand that not choosing is a way of dying while alive. The tower bells chimed, marking the end of the day. Daniel looked toward the windows, where the golden light was beginning to fade into shades of purple. I must go, he said. I leave before dawn. I know. Emily took a deep breath, making a decision that would change everything. But before you leave, you need to know one thing. He waited. If you die on this mission, a part of me will die with you. And if you live, she paused, gathering courage. If you live, I will find a way for it to mean something. For us to mean something. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if memorizing every line of her face. Then may God protect us both, he murmured finally, because we have just stepped onto territory from which there may be no return. And with those words, he turned and disappeared into the growing shadows of the chapel, leaving Emily alone with the weight of her own promise and the certainty that her life had irrevocably changed in those few stolen minutes between prayer and farewell. The days following Daniel's departure passed like a thick fog. Emily moved through the rituals of wedding preparation like an actress performing a role she didn't fully grasp, smiling at the right moments, nodding at decisions about flowers and music, trying on gowns that felt too heavy for her shoulders. Daniel's absence was a constant presence, a void she carried like a stone in her chest. Each morning, upon waking, she would briefly forget he was gone, and the memory would return like a fresh stab. You look very pale, my dear, commented the Duchess of Thornfield, Prince Andrew's mother, as she watched Emily try on the wedding gown for the third time that week. It is normal to feel nervous before the wedding, but you cannot appear ill at the altar. Emily forced a smile, keeping her arms raised, while the seamstresses adjusted the embroidered fabric. Just a bit anxious, Your Grace. It is such an important moment. It certainly is. The Duchess approached, her blue eyes so similar to her son's, studying Emily with calculated attention. Andrew told me about your reaction to that night's hearing. Daniel Morgan, wasn't it? Emily felt her blood run cold, but kept her expression neutral. It was an interesting spectacle, Your Grace. One rarely sees such varied displays of knowledge. Interesting. The Duchess repeated the word as if testing its weight. Yes, I suppose it was, though some considered it excessive for a man of his station. Is knowledge excessive when one does not possess the proper lineage to sustain it? Emily couldn't prevent the question from escaping, charged with an irony that made the Duchess raise an eyebrow. Dear child, the older woman said, moving closer until she was right next to her. Emily could smell roses and something more bitter, perhaps absinthe. Knowledge without wisdom is a dangerous weapon. And wisdom includes understanding one's place in the world. And what would my place be, Your Grace? Beside my son, as his wife, his counselor, the future mother of the realm's heirs. The Duchess lightly touched Emily's shoulder, a gesture that felt more threatening than maternal. It is a place of great honor and great responsibility. I hope you understand what that means. Emily understood perfectly. The message was clear. Forget the night, accept your destiny, don't cause trouble. But instead of feeling intimidated, a new determination grew in her chest. I understand completely, she said, meeting the Duchess's eyes, and I hope to live up to all expectations. Later, alone in her chambers, Emily allowed herself a few moments of raw honesty. She walked to the window facing north, in the direction she knew Daniel had gone. There was no news of him, which could mean either that he was well or that something terrible had happened. The uncertainty gnawed at her like a hungry animal. A soft knock on the door brought her back to the present. It was Margaret, carrying a tray with tea and a worried expression. "Milady," the lady-in-waiting said, pouring the tea with careful movements. "News has arrived from the border." Emily nearly dropped the cup. What kind of news? Conflicts with smugglers, several skirmishes, but no specific message about the people who interest us. They had developed this discreet code to speak of Daniel without mentioning his name directly. It was a necessary precaution. The castle walls had ears, and Emily had begun to suspect that some of those ears reported directly to Prince Andrew. I see. Emily drank the tea slowly, using the time to organize her thoughts. Margaret, do you know anyone who could obtain more specific information? Milady, that would be extremely dangerous. More dangerous than marrying without knowing if the person who... Emily stopped, realizing she was about to say too much, even to Margaret. I need to know if he is well. I cannot explain why, but I must. Margaret watched her mistress for a long moment, seeing something in Emily's eyes that made her sigh and nod. I know a squire who serves in military communications. Perhaps he can find something out, but we must be very discreet. I will be. And Margaret? Emily took her lady-in-waiting's hand. Thank you for everything. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She stayed at the window late, watching the stars and trying to imagine where Daniel was at that exact moment. Was he looking at the same sky? Was he thinking of her just as she couldn't stop thinking of him? When she finally lay down, her dreams were populated by fragmented images. Daniel wounded, Daniel fighting, Daniel simply disappearing. She woke up several times during the night, her heart pounding and cold sweat on her brow. The next morning she received a summons to meet Andrew in the gardens. It was unusual. Their meetings usually took place in the formal chambers. But when she arrived at the designated spot, she understood the choice. The garden was in full bloom, a perfect setting for a young couple strolling before their wedding. Also perfect for anyone who wanted to convey a specific image to potential observers. Emily, you are radiant this morning. Andrew greeted her, offering his arm. He wore casual but elegant clothes, and his smile seemed genuinely warm. It was unnerving when he behaved this way, almost making her forget the darker moments. Your Highness is very kind, she replied, accepting the offered arm. They walked in silence for a few minutes, passing the rose beds and ornamental fountains. Emily tried to relax, to enjoy the beauty of the moment, but there was an underlying tension that kept her alert. Have you thought about our honeymoon? Andrew asked casually. I was considering a trip to the southern estates. Warmer climate, different landscapes. It would be a pleasant change after all the wedding commotion. That sounds lovely. Emily said, though her mind was far from honeymoons and romantic trips. Or perhaps you prefer something closer, he continued, stopping next to a particularly exuberant rosebush. We have that property on the eastern border, very isolated, very peaceful. Something in his tone made Emily turn to study his expression. There was a predatory quality in his eyes that made her shiver. The eastern border? She repeated. Wouldn't that be dangerous, with all the recent conflicts? Oh, don't worry about that. Andrew smiled, but there was no warmth in the gesture. The conflicts are being resolved. Permanently, I hope. Emily felt as if the ground had shaken beneath her feet. There was something in the way he said permanently that filled her with dread. Was it a threat, a warning, or simply her imagination running wild? Emily, Andrew said, turning to face her completely, I hope you understand how important it is for me to have a wife I can completely trust. Someone whose interests align with mine. Naturally, Your Highness, because it would be very sad if I discovered that my wife maintains divided loyalties. That would create a very uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. Emily met his eyes, clearly seeing the threat behind the polite words. My loyalty will always be to my husband and my family, Your Highness. What a relief to hear that. He leaned in and lightly kissed her forehead, a gesture that to any observer would seem tender. To Emily, it felt like a seal being pressed onto her freedom. Only 1 week now, my dear. 1 week and you will be my wife forever. When he escorted her back to the castle, Emily felt as if she were walking toward her own execution. 1 week. In 1 week, it would be too late for anything, for hopes, for choices, for Daniel, for herself. That afternoon, Margaret arrived with news that made her stagger. There were rumors of an ambush on the northern border, several men wounded, some killed, and among the missing, a knight who spoke many languages. Emily had to sit down to keep from fainting. The world around her seemed to be disintegrating, and she didn't know if Daniel was alive or dead, if he would return, or if she had lost him forever. 1 week. Only 1 week remained to find out if there was still something left to fight for. St. Benedict's Abbey was a 3-day ride from the castle, nestled among hills covered with ancient oaks. It was there that Emily headed on a cold Thursday morning, escorted by 2 guards and accompanied only by Margaret. Officially, it was a spiritual pilgrimage before the wedding, a respectable custom for high-born brides. In reality, it was the only way Emily could imagine finding out what had happened to Daniel. Margaret's squire had whispered fragmented information. A gravely wounded knight had been taken to the abbey after the ambush, a man who spoke in many languages during the delirium of fever. The monks kept him in quarantine, fearing infection, but he was alive. Alive. Emily clung to that word throughout the journey, repeating it like a mantra against the despair that threatened to consume her. Alive meant hope. Alive meant that perhaps there was still time for impossibilities to become possible. Prince Andrew had initially resisted the idea of the pilgrimage, but Emily's insistence finally overcame his reluctance. She argued that she needed spiritual peace before the wedding, that the rumors of border conflicts made her anxious, that only a few days of prayer and contemplation would allow her to return refreshed for the nuptials. It was a lie woven with threads of truth. She really was anxious. She really needed answers. Are you sure about this, milady? Margaret asked when they stopped to rest the horses at an inn on the 2nd day of travel. Her voice was laden with worry. If we find out it truly is him, and if the prince learns that you— The prince will not know, Emily interrupted, drinking fresh water from a well, unless you intend to tell him. Of course not. But, milady, if Sir Daniel is indeed at the abbey, what do you intend to do? You cannot simply— Emily knew Margaret was right. She couldn't simply appear in the infirmary and declare love for a dying knight. But she needed to see him. She needed to know if he would live. She needed to say the things she might never have the opportunity to say again. I will find a way, she said simply. On the morning of the 3rd day, the abbey towers appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the grey sky. Emily felt her heart race, a mix of hope and terror taking hold of her. In a few hours she would know the truth. Abbot Anselm received them personally, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and hands marked by manual labor. Emily explained the purpose of her visit in suitably vague terms: prayer, contemplation, spiritual preparation for the wedding. Naturally, Lady Emily, the abbot said. It will be an honor to host you. We have prepared suitable chambers in the guest building. If I may observe, you chose an interesting time for your visit. We have been busy lately. Busy? Emily tried to keep her tone casual. A wounded knight was brought here a few days ago. Serious cases always demand special attention from our herbalist brothers. The abbot watched her carefully. Perhaps you have already heard. News travels quickly between the castles. Emily nodded vaguely. I hope he recovers. By the grace of God, yes. Although he was... The abbot hesitated. A peculiar case. The physical injury was not the most serious of his problems. How so? Delirium. A high fever that lasted 3 days. And the languages... Abbot Anselm shook his head in admiration. I have never seen anything like it. He spoke in tongues that some of our most learned brothers recognized, others that seemed completely foreign, as if he carried the knowledge of the entire world in his feverish mind. Emily had to lean against the wall to keep from stumbling. It was him. It was definitely Daniel. Is it common for this to happen with head injuries? She managed to ask. Oh, it was not a head injury. An arrow in the shoulder, some blade cuts. Nothing life-threatening once properly treated. The delirium, well, sometimes the body expresses trauma in mysterious ways. The abbot studied Emily more closely. May I ask why you are interested in the case? Emily forced an expression of appropriate Christian compassion. Any soul in suffering deserves our prayers, Abbot Anselm. Perhaps I can include his recovery in my contemplations. How kind of you. The abbot's smile was genuine. Brother Thomas is caring for him in the infirmary. I am sure your prayers will be welcome. Emily spent the rest of the day feigning devotion, attending an evening mass and conversing politely with the monks about spiritual topics, but her mind was entirely focused on a single question: how to reach Daniel. The opportunity arose the next morning. Abbot Anselm mentioned during breakfast that he needed to travel to a neighboring monastery regarding administrative matters and would be absent until the afternoon. Most of the monks would be working in the fields or the library. The infirmary would be under the sole care of Brother Thomas. Emily asked permission to spend the morning in silent prayer in the cloister garden. Once alone, she waited until she was sure she wasn't being observed, then discreetly headed for the infirmary building. Brother Thomas was a young man, not much older than her, with a kind face and delicate hands of someone who cared for the sick with genuine vocation. Emily found him preparing herbal poultices. Brother, she said softly, I came to offer my prayers for the wounded knight. The abbot mentioned he is recovering. How generous, milady. Yes, Sir Daniel is much better. The fever broke last night, and today for the first time he spoke coherently. Thomas smiled. Though he is still very weak, would it be appropriate for me to see him, to offer words of Christian comfort? Thomas hesitated. Well, I suppose there would be no harm in it, as long as it is brief. He still needs a lot of rest. Emily's heart was beating so fast, she was sure Thomas could hear it. Naturally, just a few minutes. He led her through a series of corridors to a small cell that served as an infirmary room. Emily took a deep breath before entering, preparing herself for what she might find. Daniel was lying on a simple bed, his torso partially bandaged, his face thinner than she remembered but unequivocally alive. When their eyes met, Emily saw a flash of something, surprise, relief, joy, cross his expression before he tried to sit up. Don't move, she said quickly, approaching the bed. You are wounded, Lady Emily. His voice was hoarse but firm. Why are you here? Spiritual pilgrimage, she replied, aware that Thomas was still at the door. I came to pray for the recovery of the wounded. I will leave you in peace for your prayers, the monk said kindly, but only a few minutes, please. He still needs rest. When they were alone, Emily allowed herself to truly look at Daniel. There were lines of pain around his eyes, and his skin had a pallor that spoke of how much he had suffered. But he was alive. He was awake. He was looking at her as if she were a miracle. They thought you were dead, she whispered. The rumors... I almost was. He extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. The ambush, it wasn't accidental, Emily. Someone ensured we arrived at the right place at the wrong time. What are you saying? That I was sent to die, and that only divine mercy and the skill of these monks kept me alive. He squeezed her hand. But you, Emily, you shouldn't be here. If they find out, they won't find out. And I couldn't marry without knowing what had happened to you. Marry? He closed his eyes for a moment. When? In 2 days. The silence that followed was charged with everything they couldn't say, with all the impossibilities that stretched between them like an abyss. Emily, he said finally, his voice heavy with painful determination, you must go through with the wedding. What? It is your only protection now. If you back out, if the prince suspects that you... He struggled to sit up, ignoring the evident pain. Other forces at work that you don't understand. People who would kill to keep certain secrets. Your only safety lies in becoming untouchable through marriage. But what about you? What about us? Daniel brought her hand to his lips, kissing it with desperate tenderness. There is no us, my dear, there cannot be, not in this world. Emily felt tears burn her eyes. So this is it? You survive and I marry Andrew and we pretend there was never anything between us? It is the only way to keep us both alive. I don't accept that. Her voice trembled with emotion. I don't accept that fear should determine our lives. Then you are braver than you are sensible, he said, echoing her words from the chapel. But Emily, listen to me. There are things I discovered on the border. Corruption, treason. Andrew is not just a jealous prince. He is involved in dealings that could destroy the realm, and people like us are expendable if we know too much. Emily looked into his eyes, seeing the brutal truth he was trying to protect her from facing. But at the same time, she saw something else, a determination that mirrored her own. Then we fight, she said simply. We find a way to fight. Emily, either you love me or you don't, Daniel Morgan. And if you love me, then you cannot ask me to accept a life without hope. He looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a new resolve. May God forgive me, but you are right. I love you, and perhaps that means we should at least try to find a way to make this work. Outside, footsteps approached. Emily quickly moved away from the bed. The wedding will happen as planned, she whispered, but this will not be the end of our story. Emily, what are you thinking? That a princess has much more power than a promised bride, she said, a fierce smile appearing on her lips, and perhaps it is time to learn how to use it. When Brother Thomas returned, he found Lady Emily kneeling beside the bed in silent prayer, and the wounded knight resting peacefully. But both now carried something they hadn't before, a plan that was beginning to take shape. Dangerous and impossible, but representing the only chance to transform their love into something more powerful than fear. The tower bell rang incessantly, marking the wedding morning with an insistence that seemed to echo the frantic beats of Emily's heart. She sat before the mirror in her chambers, watching Margaret make the final adjustments to her hair, when each chime reminded her that in a few hours she would be Princess Emily Collins. The gown was a work of art, French silk embroidered with silver thread, pearls sewn one by one, forming delicate spiderweb-like patterns. The skirt spread around her like snow clouds, and her great-grandmother's veil completed the ensemble with an aura of tradition and solemn responsibility. "You look beautiful, milady," Margaret said, but her voice carried a note of melancholy. Both knew that this beauty was being prepared for a sacrifice disguised as a celebration. Emily lightly touched the diamond necklace Andrew had given her the night before, a thoughtful gesture that made her feel even guiltier about the betrayals she was planning, because, yes, they were betrayals. No matter how she tried to justify it, she was about to marry one man while secretly planning to find ways to be with another. "Margaret," she said, watching the maid's reflection in the mirror, "do you remember the conversation we had about loyalty?" "Yes, milady. Today it will be tested, and I want you to know that whatever your choice, I will not judge you." Emily turned to face Margaret directly. "But if you choose to remain by my side, things will become complicated." Margaret met her eyes. "Milady, I have served your family since you were a child. A marriage will not change that." A knock on the door interrupted them. It was a page announcing that Prince Andrew requested a private audience with the bride before the ceremony. Emily felt her stomach clench, but she nodded graciously. Andrew entered a few minutes later, resplendent in his military dress uniform. The medals on his chest caught the morning light, and for a moment Emily could see exactly why any woman in the realm would feel honored by his attention. He was, objectively, an impressive man. "Emily," he said, approaching, "you are stunning." "Thank you, Your Highness." He took her hands, and Emily noticed that his trembled slightly. It was the first time she had seen Andrew show any kind of nervousness, and it humanized him in an unexpected way. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, his gaze intense, "about our life together, about what I expect from you." Emily waited in silence. "I know you may not love me now," Andrew continued. "I know this marriage was arranged by our families, not chosen by us. But I hope that in time we can build something true between us." The words were sincere, charged with a vulnerability Andrew rarely showed. Emily felt a genuine pang of guilt. "Andrew," she said softly, may I ask you a question?" "Naturally. What would you do if you discovered I harbored feelings for another?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Andrew's face gradually hardened, the vulnerability replaced by something more familiar: control, possessiveness. "That would be unacceptable," he said finally. "A wife must be loyal to her husband in thought and deed, especially a princess. And if those feelings existed before the marriage, then it would be the wife's responsibility to eradicate them completely." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Emily, why are you asking this question?" "Feminine curiosity," she said, forcing a smile. "I want to understand exactly what is expected of me." Andrew studied her for a long moment. "What is expected is absolute loyalty, exclusive. Anything less than that would be problematic for all parties involved." The threat was clear. Emily nodded as if she were merely clarifying a point of etiquette. "I understand perfectly." "Good." Andrew's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then I will see you at the altar in 1 hour." After he left, Emily had to sit down to catch her breath. The encounter had clarified one thing. Andrew knew, perhaps not specific details, but he knew there was something, and he was making it clear that such something would not be tolerated. "Milady?" Margaret watched her with concern. "I am fine." Emily stood up, a new determination crystallizing in her mind. "In fact, I am better than fine. Now I know exactly what we are dealing with." The next hour passed in a blur. The walk to the chapel, rows of guests rising at her passage, the aroma of incense and flowers filling the air. The archbishop waiting at the altar in his golden robes, Andrew at his side, with an expression of controlled satisfaction. Emily walked down the central aisle holding her father's arm, smiling graciously at the guests, perfectly playing the role of the radiant bride. But her mind was calculating, planning, preparing for games much more complicated than a simple matrimonial ceremony. When she reached the altar, Andrew took her hand and whispered, "You are beautiful, my future wife." "Thank you, my future husband," she replied, and there was something in her tone that made Andrew look at her more closely. The archbishop began the ceremony, his pompous voice echoing through the chapel vaults. Emily responded to the vows with appropriate precision, promised to honor and obey, accepted the ring that officially sealed her new position. But when the moment came for the kiss that would consecrate the marriage, Emily looked directly into Andrew's eyes and whispered, too low for anyone but him to hear, "I am a princess now, and princesses have rights that promised brides do not." Andrew kissed her harder than necessary, a physical reminder of who controlled what. But when they separated, Emily smiled with a serenity that disconcerted him. The reception was a whirlwind of congratulations, toasts, and dances. Emily played her part perfectly, the graceful new princess, charming, seemingly radiant with her new position. She danced with important nobles, conversed with foreign diplomats, received expensive gifts with appropriate gratitude. But throughout the entire party, a part of her mind was working independently, observing, cataloguing, planning. She noticed who spoke with Andrew in discreet corners, which messengers arrived and departed silently, where the real conversations of power took place away from the music and laughter. Being a princess, Emily realized, meant having access to information that was previously denied to her. It meant that important people would need to court her, at least superficially. It meant she could ask questions that would be answered, even if reluctantly. When the party finally ended and she retired to her new chambers, now the princely quarters she would share with Andrew, Emily felt strangely invigorated. The wedding had happened, the trap had closed, but she did not feel defeated. She felt transformed. "Margaret," she said when they were alone, "tomorrow we will begin to learn exactly what it means to be a princess. And we will find out if there are ways to use that power that our enemies did not anticipate. And what if we find those limits are smaller than we hope?" Emily smiled, an expression that would have surprised anyone who knew her before the wedding. It was the smile of a woman who had discovered her own strength. "Then we will expand those limits, one diplomatic skill at a time." The first 2 weeks as Princess Emily Collins were a crash course in politics, power, and patience. She quickly discovered that being the wife of the heir to the throne came with privileges she needed to learn to exploit subtly, and responsibilities she could use as a shield for her true intentions. Andrew was a publicly attentive husband and appropriately respectful in private. He did not demand affection she could not give, but he made it clear that he expected absolute loyalty and total discretion. Their conversations were limited to practical matters, social agenda, diplomatic issues, the appearances they needed to maintain. Emily learned to navigate these waters with increasing care. During the day, she perfectly played the role of the devoted princess. She attended meetings with court ladies, organized charity events, received foreign ambassadors alongside her husband. But in the quiet hours, when Andrew was busy with military affairs or council meetings, she began to build her own network of information. Margaret had proven to be a more valuable ally than Emily had ever imagined. The woman had a natural ability to extract information from other servants, and her position as the princess's lady-in-waiting gave her access to previously unthinkable circles. It was Margaret who brought the first useful piece of information. "Your Highness," she said one grey morning while Emily pretended to study official correspondence, "there is news about the knight." Emily's heart quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "What kind of news?" "He has fully recovered from his injuries. He is still at the Abbey, but no longer as a patient. It seems he is assisting with some administrative matters." Emily looked up from the scrolls. "Administrative matters?" "The Abbey keeps detailed records of everything that happens in the region. Births, deaths, marriages, commercial transactions. And apparently our knight has a particular skill for organizing this type of information." An idea began to form in Emily's mind. If Daniel was at the Abbey, if he had access to regional records, if he was still using his linguistic and organizational skills. "Margaret, do you think it would be possible to send a letter to the Abbey? Officially, of course, as part of my princely charity obligations." Margaret looked at her with gradual understanding. "A donation for the region's poor. It would be very appropriate for a new princess to demonstrate Christian generosity." "Exactly." Emily spent the rest of the morning carefully drafting an official letter to Abbot Anselm. Officially, she was informing him of a substantial donation to help the needy in the region and requesting reports on how the funds would be used. Unofficially, she was establishing a line of communication, but it was at the end of the letter, in a section seemingly dedicated to religious courtesies, that Emily included her true message. She wrote in Latin, then in French, then in the ancient language Daniel had used at the hearing. To any casual reader, it would seem merely a display of princely erudition. To Daniel, it would be a clear declaration: "I am here, I am safe, and I have not forgotten." The response arrived 2 weeks later. Abbot Anselm effusively thanked the princess for her generosity and detailed how the funds would be used to improve the conditions of the local poor. He included a meticulous inventory of the region's needs, organized in an impressively detailed manner. But Emily was only interested in the last page of the report, where there was a list of historical records preserved by the Abbey. It was a seemingly innocent cataloguing of ancient documents, but Emily recognized the pattern immediately. Daniel had organized the list so that the first letters of each item formed a message when read in sequence: alive, safe, awaiting instructions. Emily had to sit down to keep from betraying her emotion. Not only was Daniel well, but he had perfectly understood her coded message and was prepared to maintain secret correspondence. But communication would not be enough. Emily needed something more substantial, a way to use her new position to protect Daniel and perhaps create opportunities for future meetings. The opportunity arose unexpectedly a week later. Andrew arrived home one afternoon with a particularly somber expression. During dinner, he casually mentioned that there were problems on the northern border, the same region where Daniel had been ambushed. "Smugglers have become bolder," Andrew said, cutting his meat with precise movements. "And there are suspicions that some local nobles may be involved. A full investigation will be necessary." "What kind of investigation?" Emily asked. "Audits of commercial records, verification of financial transactions, interrogations of suspicious merchants." Andrew looked at her over his wineglass. Tedious work, but necessary to maintain order. Emily saw the opportunity crystallizing before her. "That would require someone with knowledge of various languages and commercial customs, I imagine." "Yes. Why do you ask?" "Well," Emily said carefully, "I recall that night at the hearing. Daniel Morgan. He demonstrated impressive knowledge of commercial and linguistic practices. He would be useful for this type of investigation." Andrew stopped eating, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You remember many details about that hearing?" Emily forced a light laugh. "It was a memorable spectacle. One rarely sees such varied displays of knowledge." She drank wine to buy time, carefully calculating her next words. "Besides, as a princess, I feel I should be aware of the talents available to serve the realm, especially talents that might be underutilized." "Underutilized talents," Andrew repeated. "A man capable of communicating with foreign merchants, understanding complex contracts, identifying irregularities in commercial records. Sounds exactly like what you need for your investigation. Emily maintained a practical, almost businesslike tone. Unless you already have someone with similar qualifications? Andrew watched her for a long moment. Emily could see him calculating, considering whether her suggestion was strategic or suspicious. Daniel Morgan was sent on a mission from which he has not yet returned, he said finally. Oh, Emily managed to look genuinely surprised. I hope he has not encountered difficulties. Reports indicate he was wounded, but is recovering at a local abbey, St. Benedict's, I believe. What a relief, Emily said. Then he will be available when he fully recovers. Perfect for your investigation, should you decide to use him. She could see Andrew weighing the options. On one hand, Daniel was clearly the most qualified person for the job. On the other, there were his suspicions about Emily's motivations. Perhaps, he said finally, when he is fully recovered. Emily nodded and changed the subject, but she knew she had planted a seed. In the following days, she mentioned the investigation in conversations with other court members, always casually, always emphasizing the need for someone with specialized linguistic knowledge. A week later, Andrew announced that he had decided to recall Daniel Morgan to lead the investigation on the northern border. An excellent choice, Emily said, allowing herself a genuine smile. I'm sure he will serve the realm with distinction. Yes, Andrew said, but there was something in his eyes that made her realize the game was only just beginning. I'm sure he will. That night, Emily drafted another letter to the abbey, officially requesting prayers for the safety of all who served the realm on dangerous missions. Unofficially, she was sending a very different message. Prepare yourself. Things are about to change. When Margaret brought the response a few days later, Emily knew Daniel had understood. The list of historical records this time formed a much longer message when decoded. I understand. I am ready. Trust me, as I trust you. Together we will find a way to make this possible. Emily carefully folded the letter and stored it with the other official correspondence. To any casual observer, it was just another charity communication. But to her, it represented something much more valuable: hope. Daniel would return to court in a few weeks. It would be dangerous. It would be complicated. It would require careful diplomacy from both sides. But for the first time since the wedding, Emily felt she had a real plan. And more importantly, she felt she was no longer alone in it. Margaret, she said that afternoon, watching the preparations for receiving the returning investigators from the border through the window. I think it is time to learn exactly what the limits of princely power are. And what if we find those limits are smaller than we hope? Emily smiled, an expression that would have surprised anyone who knew her before the wedding. It was the smile of a woman who had discovered her own strength. Then we will expand those limits, one diplomatic skill at a time. Daniel Morgan returned to the castle on an autumn morning when the leaves painted the air gold and red. Emily watched him from her chamber window, her heart pounding as she saw him ride through the gates. He looked stronger than when she had left him at the abbey, his posture erect and confident, but there was something different in his expression, a new gravity, as if the months of absence had taught him lessons he would rather not have learned. She knew she couldn't go down to greet him. It would be inappropriate and suspicious. Instead, she had to settle for that glimpse through the window and the promise that they would soon find a way to talk properly. The opportunity arose 2 days later. Andrew had organized a formal meeting to discuss the findings of the border investigation. As princess, Emily had the right to participate in certain governmental discussions, especially those that might affect the well-being of the realm. It was a right she had been carefully exercising since the wedding, establishing her presence in meetings without seeming overly interested in political power. The meeting took place in the smaller council hall with about a dozen people present: Andrew, a few senior advisors, military representatives, and Daniel as the investigation specialist. Emily entered after everyone was seated, graciously greeted those present, and took her place in a side chair reserved for observers. When her eyes met Daniel's, it was only for a moment, but enough for her to see that he was as aware of her presence as she was of his. There was a controlled tension in his posture, as if he were forcing himself not to look directly at her. "Sir Daniel," Andrew said, his voice formal, "welcome back. We trust your recovery was complete." "Completely, Your Highness. Thank you for your concern." "Excellent. Now regarding your investigation." Daniel opened a set of documents organized with the precision Emily remembered. "The findings are revealing, Your Highness. There is clear evidence of organized smuggling on the northern border, but the implications extend far beyond what we initially suspected. Emily watched Andrew carefully as Daniel spoke. There was something in the prince's expression, an almost imperceptible tension, that made her suspect he knew more about the smuggling than he was admitting. "What kind of evidence?" asked one of the advisors. Daniel distributed documents to those present. Emily noticed that he included a copy for her, a gesture that was technically correct, but made Andrew frown slightly. "Records of transactions that do not match official manifests," Daniel explained. "Goods appearing in local markets that never pass through regulatory checkpoints, and more worryingly, enough gold circulating in border taverns to suggest someone is being very well paid to turn a blind eye." Emily studied the documents, impressed by the meticulousness of the investigation. Daniel had not only identified the irregularities, but had traced patterns that revealed a sophisticated and well-funded operation. "Your recommendations?" Andrew asked, but Emily noticed a note of coldness in his voice. "Immediate arrests of the identified merchants, a complete audit of all border officials and—" Daniel hesitated for a moment. "Investigation of anyone in a position of authority who might be facilitating these operations." The silence that followed was tense. Emily saw several advisors exchanging uncomfortable glances. "That is a serious accusation," Andrew said slowly. "Are you suggesting there is treason among the realm's nobles?" "I am suggesting that the scale and sophistication of the operation require protection from someone with significant authority," Daniel replied calmly. "The data does not lie, Your Highness. Someone highly placed is involved." Emily felt a cold current run down her spine when she saw Andrew's expression harden. She began to understand why Daniel had been ambushed and why his life was still in danger. "Well," Andrew said finally, "these are allegations that require careful investigation before any rash action." "Naturally, Your Highness, but I must recommend urgency. With each passing day, more evidence may disappear." "Your concern is noted, Sir Daniel. We will discuss the next steps in due time." Andrew stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Everyone may withdraw." "Sir Daniel, wait a moment." Emily rose with the others, but as she walked to the door, she managed to catch part of the conversation between Andrew and Daniel. "Your investigation was thorough," Andrew was saying. "Perhaps too thorough. Your Highness, sometimes it is better not to look too deeply into certain matters, especially when it can lead to unnecessary complications." Emily stopped in the hallway outside, pretending to organize her documents while trying to hear the rest of the conversation. Margaret appeared at her side, seemingly by chance. "Trouble, Your Highness?" Margaret whispered. "Big trouble," Emily whispered back, "and I don't think Sir Daniel fully understands what he has gotten himself into." That afternoon, Emily made a risky decision. She sent Margaret with a discreet message. The princess would like to consult Sir Daniel about charity possibilities in the border regions affected by smuggling. It was a plausible justification for a meeting, especially considering her recent history of charitable work. Daniel appeared in her chambers early that evening, escorted by Margaret and maintaining a respectful distance. But Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly darted toward the door. "Sir Daniel," she said formally, "thank you for coming. I am interested in organizing aid for the families affected by the instability on the border." "That is very generous of you, Your Highness." His voice was carefully neutral, but Emily caught the subtext. He knew there was more to this meeting than charity. "Margaret, could you check if there is tea in the kitchen?" Emily said. It was a code they had developed. Margaret would leave the chamber and stand guard at the door. When they were alone, Emily walked to stand near Daniel, but not too close. They needed to maintain appearances even in private. "You are in danger," she said without preamble. "I know. Andrew is not just a jealous prince, Daniel. He is involved in the smuggling you investigated." Daniel nodded gravely. "I suspected as much when I saw the patterns of protection. Someone with royal authority would be needed to orchestrate everything. Then why did you submit the report? Why didn't you edit the findings?" "Because if I had done that, he would know that I know. At least this way there is ambiguity." Daniel looked directly at her for the first time since entering. "And because you were at the meeting, you needed to know the truth." Emily felt her heart race. "And now, what do we do? Now we need to be more careful than ever. Andrew cannot eliminate me immediately. It would be too suspicious after the report. But he will look for a way to neutralize me. And what about us?" The question hung in the air. Daniel took a step closer, and Emily could see the struggle in his eyes, between what he wanted and what he knew was prudent. "Emily," he said softly, "we are the biggest threat Andrew faces. not just because we know about the smuggling, but because we represent something he cannot control. What do you mean? I mean, a prince can handle treason, he can handle corruption, he can handle military threats, but he cannot handle a wife who has chosen to love another man. Daniel took a deep breath. It questions his authority in a way he will never forgive. Emily understood the full implication of his words. So we are both in danger. We are, but we also have something he doesn't. What? Daniel smiled, and for the first time in months, Emily saw genuine hope in his expression. We have the truth and we have each other. Those are powers he doesn't understand how to fight. Emily took another step forward, reducing the distance between them to almost nothing. Daniel, what are you proposing? That we stop trying to be careful, he said, raising his hand to lightly touch her face. That we start being truly strategic. The touch of his fingers on her skin sent waves of warmth through her body. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel what she had been denying for so long. What if we are discovered? Then at least we will have lived. He leaned in, whispering close to her ear. And perhaps we will have exposed enough corruption to protect the realm in the process. Emily opened her eyes and met his, seeing in them a determination that mirrored her own transformation. They were no longer the promised bride and the landless knight who met months earlier. They were two people who had discovered their own strength through danger and loss. Then let the real game begin, she murmured. Outside, footsteps approached. Margaret returning with the tea, or perhaps Andrew returning earlier than usual. Daniel quickly moved away, resuming his formal posture. But when Emily looked into his eyes once more before he left, she saw something that filled her with fierce determination. The war had begun, and this time they would fight it together. The final confrontation arrived unexpectedly, on a morning when snow began to cover the castle gardens with a white mantle that transformed the world into something ethereal and silent. Emily was in her chambers, answering correspondence, when Margaret burst in without announcement, her face pale with urgency. "Your Highness," she said, quickly closing the door. "Sir Daniel has been arrested." Emily's blood froze in her veins. "On what charge?" "Treason. Prince Andrew claims to have found evidence that he was selling military information to foreign smugglers." Emily stood up so quickly, she knocked over her chair. "That is impossible. It is a fabrication." "I know, Your Highness, but Andrew has documents. He has witnesses. It looks very convincing to those who don't know the truth." Emily's mind worked quickly. Andrew had finally found his way to eliminate Daniel, and in a way that would not only remove the threat, but completely discredit him. If Daniel were executed for treason, any allegation of princely corruption would be seen as the lie of a desperate man. "Where is he being held?" "In the castle dungeons. The trial is scheduled for after midday." Emily looked out the window, seeing the snow continue to fall. She had only a few hours, and for the first time since becoming princess, she wasn't sure if her title would be enough to protect someone she loved. "Margaret," she said, an iron determination taking hold of her voice. "You must send for Abbot Anselm immediately. Say it is a matter of extreme spiritual urgency." "The abbot of the monastery?" "Your Highness, he is 3 days away." "Not Abbot Anselm in person. I need the records he keeps. Remember the letters we exchanged. Daniel organized those records for a reason. If I am right, they contain evidence of the real corruption on the border." Margaret nodded and left quickly. Emily was left alone, trying to organize her thoughts. She had evidence, but she needed time to present it properly. And more importantly, she needed to ensure Daniel survived long enough for the truth to come out. There was only one way to achieve that. Emily headed for Andrew's chambers, ignoring the usual protocols for requesting an audience. She burst into his quarters like the snowstorm growing outside. "Andrew," she said without preamble, "we need to talk." He was sitting at his desk, examining documents Emily recognized as the false evidence against Daniel. When he saw her enter, a cold smile appeared on his lips. "Emily, darling, I knew you would show up. I imagine you've heard about our multilingual knight." "I heard your lies, if that's what you mean." Andrew's smile widened. "Lies? I have documents signed by him, witnesses who saw him receiving gold from foreign agents, coded correspondence with enemies of the realm, forged documents, bought witnesses, fabricated correspondence." Emily approached the desk, planting her hands on it and leaning in to face him. "I thought you were smarter than this, Andrew, and I thought you were more loyal," he retorted, standing up. "But it seems we were both mistaken about many things." "Loyalty," Emily repeated. "Speaking of loyalty, how about we discuss your loyalty to the realm you are supposed to protect?" "What are you talking about?" Emily took a deep breath, preparing for the biggest risk of her life. I am talking about your association with the smugglers Daniel investigated. I am talking about the gold you receive in exchange for turning a blind eye to illegal operations on the border. I am talking about the real reason you sent Daniel into an ambush. Andrew's face hardened dangerously. Be careful, Emily. You are treading on very dangerous territory. Good, because dangerous is where the truth lives. Emily stepped away from the desk, walking toward the window. The question now, Andrew, is whether you are prepared to kill your own wife to keep your secrets. My own wife would not betray me, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Emily turned to face him. Your wife has already betrayed you, in thought, if not in deed. And she will continue to betray you every day for the rest of your life because she loves another man. The words hung in the air like sharp blades. Emily saw the exact moment Andrew understood that she had declared open war. So you confirm it, he said softly. You confirm you have feelings for Daniel Morgan. I confirm that I love him, Emily said simply. I confirm that I would rather die than live a lie. And I confirm that I know exactly what kind of man you are. Andrew studied her for a long moment. And what kind of man am I, my dear wife? The kind who sacrifices honor for power. The kind who kills innocents to protect his profits. The kind who would forge evidence against an honest man because he cannot bear to be overshadowed by someone of lower birth. Emily took a step forward. In short, the kind of man who should not be near the throne. The slap came quickly, snapping Emily's head to the side. She touched her face, feeling the warm blood on her lip, but she did not back down. Feel better? She asked calmly. You have two choices, Andrew said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. You can attend the trial and testify against Daniel Morgan, confirming that he tried to seduce you for privileged information. Or you can watch as I execute him publicly for treason and then find out what happens to princesses who forget their station. Emily smiled, and there was something so fierce in the expression that Andrew involuntarily took a step back. Or, she said, you can find out what happens when a princess decides to stop pretending to be harmless. At that moment, Margaret reappeared at the door carrying a chest of documents. Behind her came Abbot Anselm in person, his face grave but determined. Abbot Anselm, Emily said, not taking her eyes off Andrew. What a surprise! I didn't expect you to make the journey so quickly. When I learned of the urgency of the situation, Your Highness, I felt it was my Christian duty to come personally. The abbot looked at Andrew, offering a respectful bow. Your Highness, I brought the records your wife requested, documents that I believe are relevant to matters of justice in the realm. What records? Andrew asked, but Emily could see that he was beginning to understand that he had gravely underestimated the situation. Records of financial transactions in the border region, Abbot Anselm said, opening the chest, meticulously organized by Sir Daniel Morgan during his recovery at the Abbey, records that document in detail the smuggling operations he investigated. The abbot held out a set of documents, including correspondence between the smugglers and their protected patrons, correspondence that clearly identifies who was behind the operations. Andrew did not take the documents, but Emily could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what they contained. Look at that, Emily said softly. It seems our investigation was much more thorough than you imagined. That proves nothing, Andrew said, but his voice had lost its conviction. It proves enough to raise very embarrassing questions in a public trial, Emily countered. Questions about why a prince would be so desperate to silence an honest investigator. Questions about where certain unexplained financial affluence comes from. Abbot Anselm cleared his throat discreetly. If I may, Your Highness, there is also the matter of witnesses. Witnesses? Several people from the border region are prepared to testify about transactions they witnessed, including some who can identify high-ranking participants in those transactions. Emily saw defeat spreading across Andrew's face. He had been outmaneuvered, and now he faced the choice between public exposure or retreat. What do you want? He asked finally. I want Daniel released immediately, and all charges against him dropped, Emily said. I want you to publicly acknowledge that the evidence against him was but inadequate, and I want you to seriously consider a change in your business activities on the border. Andrew looked at her for a long moment, calculating costs and benefits. And in return, Emily said, these records remain in the Abbey archives as historical documents, and I remain your loyal and discreet wife, but not devoted. No, never devoted, but discreet. Andrew nodded slowly. And Daniel Morgan? He will receive a new mission, perhaps something related to diplomacy in distant regions, for an extended period. It was a painful but necessary concession. Daniel would be safe, but far away. She would be protected, but still trapped. Very well, Andrew said finally. But Emily, yes? If I ever discover that you and he didn't finish the threat, but it was clear in the air. I understand perfectly, Emily said. 2 hours later, Emily watched from the window as Daniel was escorted out of the castle. He looked up once, meeting her eyes through the glass. There were no promises in the look they exchanged, but there was something more valuable, mutual understanding that they had fought together and won, even if the victory came with sacrifices. That night, Emily received a letter. There was no sender, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. You saved me, the letter read in Latin, and in doing so, you saved yourself too. I will be eternally grateful to have known a woman of such courage. Wherever my new mission takes me, I will carry with me the memory of what it meant to be chosen by someone like you. Emily carefully folded the letter and stored it with the other Abbey correspondence. In public, it would be just another routine communication. In private, it would be the reminder that some forms of love transcend circumstances. Months later, when rumors arrived that Sir Daniel Morgan had been appointed ambassador to a distant foreign court, Emily smiled. It was a position of honor, suitable for a man of his talents, and although it was too far for visits, it was not too far for occasional diplomatic correspondence. Emily learned to use her power as princess in ways she would have considered impossible before meeting Daniel. She organized charity networks that secretly monitored corruption. She established connections with abbeys and educational institutions that preserved valuable information. She became a political force in her own right, respected by the nobility and loved by the people. Andrew never again questioned her activities or her loyalty. They developed a relationship of mutual respect based on clearly established boundaries. He would govern the realm his way, she would contribute with her own form of service. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the snow covered the gardens as it had on that fateful morning, Emily received letters from distant lands, written in languages few at court could read, letters that spoke of justice, of memory, and of the peace that comes from knowing that some choices are greater than the circumstances surrounding them. She had discovered that love did not always mean being together. Sometimes it meant being willing to fight for the other's integrity, even when it required sacrifice. And in that discovery, Emily found a form of happiness that no one could take from her, not even a prince. So the end of it. What an incredible story, right? If this romance moved you as much as it did me writing it, hit that like button to let me know you made it this far. In the comments, tell me, do you believe Emily made the right choices? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will stir your heart. See you in the next story that will make you feel all the feels.